Hello, my name is Emily, and I woke up in a hospital bed not knowing if the world I had built was still mine. The first thing I noticed was the sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint, lingering smell of stale coffee from the nurse's station down the hall. My head felt heavy, a clouded fog from painkillers and sleepless nights, and the bright hospital lights burned through it, forcing me to squint. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, whose hands had placed me here or why. And then it all rushed back. The accident, the sudden ambulance ride, Jonathan's worried face hovering above me. I tried to move, but the weight of my own body felt unfamiliar. My arm ached as if it didn't belong to me. I took a shallow breath and listened. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor beside me, a soft murmur of a conversation down the hall, the occasional squeak of a rolling cart. These small, mundane sounds anchored me to reality. I realized I was alive, but more importantly, I realized that being alive was the first time in days I could actually think clearly. And that's when it hit me. Jonathan wasn't in the room. I could hear the faint sound of his voice in my memory, calm, steady, reassuring, but now, in the silence, it sounded almost alien. My heart beat a little faster. Jonathan was my husband, my partner in everything I had worked for. Or at least, that's what I thought. The truth I was about to uncover would change that forever. The nurse came in quietly, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. "Good morning, Emily. How are we feeling today?" she asked, checking my vitals with gentle efficiency. I smiled weakly, hiding the storm inside me. "Better, I think," I said, my voice hoarse, tasting faintly of disinfectant and fear. She nodded and left the room after adjusting my four, leaving me alone again with the beeping monitor. That was when I saw it, a small envelope resting on the nightstand. At first, I thought it was just paperwork, hospital forms or bills, but something about it drew me in. I reached for it, fingers trembling, and opened it. Inside was a life insurance policy. My eyes scanned the pages quickly and my heart froze. Jonathan's name stared back at me as the sole beneficiary. There was no contingency plan, no provision for me to have any control. I felt a cold wave wash over me. He had been planning for the moment when I would no longer be here, and he would inherit everything. Memories came flooding back, unbidden, like fragments of a puzzle. The way he had smiled at me when I mentioned selling the house, the subtle way he had steered conversations toward investments, life insurance, and wills. I remembered his laughter when I had joked about leaving him all the money if something happened, and now it felt like a cruel prophecy. My hands shook as I held the paper closer, trying to steady my breath. The room felt smaller suddenly, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were conspiring with him. Jonathan returned later that afternoon, his shoes clicking softly against the tile floor before he even entered the room. He smiled, a practiced, comforting smile that felt hollow now. "Hey, Emily," he said softly, leaning over to press a kiss to my forehead. I felt my stomach twist, part of me wanting to lean into the comfort I had always associated with him, part of me recoiling from the betrayal I now suspected. "Hi," I whispered, keeping my voice steady. "How was your morning?" "Oh, busy," he said, his eyes scanning the room as if to make sure no one else was around. "Did the nurse tell you what time your next checkup is?" I nodded slowly, keeping my attention on his gestures, the subtle way his hand brushed against the paperwork on the nightstand, almost as if checking that no one had touched it. I didn't let him know that I had already seen it, that I had already read his intentions etched in black and white. Instead, I smiled faintly, my mind racing with thoughts and strategies. Had to be careful. Any sign of suspicion would send him hiding, covering his tracks further. Days passed in a blur of hospital routines, nurses and doctors' visits. Jonathan never left my side for long, always returning with excuses, meetings, calls, errands, but each absence gave me a chance to observe him in silence. I watched him closely, memorizing the subtle signs. The way he answered his phone, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way he sometimes hesitated before answering questions about finances. Each detail built the outline of a man I thought I knew, but now seemed like a stranger. One evening, when the hospital hallways were quieter and the lights dimmed slightly, I noticed Jonathan had left his phone on the nightstand. It wasn't his habit, and I felt a small thrill of opportunity. I waited until he stepped out, pretending to make a call in the hall, then carefully picked up the device. Text messages flashed on the screen, each one a dagger. There were discussions about transfers, accounts, and financial moves, written in a cold, businesslike tone. And then, the line that made my stomach drop: "When she dies, I get all the money." I read it again and again. The words seemed to burn on the screen. Jonathan, my husband, had openly confessed to his intent, thinking I would never see it. My hands were trembling so badly that I almost dropped the phone. My mind reeled with disbelief, sorrow, and an almost surreal clarity. Everything I had believed about our life together, every kiss, every word of comfort, every shared plan for the future, now tainted with the knowledge of his greed. I put the phone down slowly, my heart pounding, trying to breathe steadily. The nurse walked in then, her footsteps soft but grounding. I smiled weakly at her, pretending nothing had happened, while inside I felt the first real spark of determination. I realized that fear had been my companion until now, but anger, clarity, and resolve were taking its place. Jonathan had underestimated me, assuming that my accident would leave me vulnerable, broken, and easy to manipulate. He was wrong. Over the next several days, I began quietly observing everything. Jonathan's calls, the way he moved around the hospital, the little things he thought no one noticed. I made mental notes, cataloged suspicious gestures, and memorized conversations. Every small slip became part of a growing map of deceit. I started recording things secretly, taking photos of documents, messages, ensuring that when the time came, I would have proof. Proof of his greed, proof of his betrayal. It wasn't easy. Every interaction with him required a delicate balance between feigning vulnerability and maintaining control. I smiled when he entered, laughed at his jokes, let him hold my hand, but inside, I was sharpening my mind, planning. I knew I had to be patient. Hasty actions would ruin everything. Jonathan was clear, meticulous, and confident in his charm, but so was I, in my own way. I had to be smarter, more observant, and relentless. Late one night, the hospital was silent, except for the soft hum of machines. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory, every subtle hint I had ignored before. The betrayal weighed heavily, but so did a strange sense of empowerment. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just a patient, I was a strategist. The documents, the messages, the casual slips of conversation, they were all pieces of a puzzle I intended to solve. And Jonathan, in all his arrogance, had unknowingly given me every piece I needed. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, almost like a promise, "I see you, Jonathan. I see everything, and I will not let you take what is mine." For the first time, I felt a flicker of peace amidst the storm, a quiet, steady flame of resolve that would guide me through what was coming. The days in the hospital blurred together, each one a careful balance of appearances and secret observation. I woke early each morning, the pale light filtering through the blinds brushing across my face, and listened to the soft hum of the machines around me. There was something strangely calming in the routine, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the rhythmic steps of nurses, the distant clatter of carts down the hall. It reminded me that life moved on, even as mine felt suspended in this strange, sterile world. Jonathan was always there, or at least he made it seem that way. He'd appear with a bouquet of flowers one day, a takeaway coffee in his hand the next, his voice warm and practiced, as he told me I looked better today, Emily. And I would smile back, nodding, letting him believe I was the vulnerable, recovering wife he thought I was. But inside, I was alert, watching, calculating. Every detail mattered: the way he lingered over certain papers, the slight tension in his shoulders when the conversation turned to finances, the way his eyes darted toward the door when the phone rang. I began to create a mental map of him, noting patterns and habits. He made frequent calls to the bank, always in hushed tones, and sometimes stepped into the corridor to speak privately. I could overhear fragments, enough to understand that he was moving money, checking accounts, and discussing investments, always in a way that excluded me, always in a way that confirmed my growing suspicion that he had been planning for my absence long before the accident. One afternoon, while Jonathan was distracted by a phone call, I noticed a small envelope on his side of the chair beside my bed. The hospital had given me a laptop for medical check-ins, and next to it was the envelope, partially hidden under a magazine. Something about it called to me, a mixture of curiosity and dread. I waited until he stepped out to speak with a nurse, and then carefully slid it toward me. Inside were statements, legal forms, and documents that detailed accounts I had never known existed. My eyes widened as I realized the magnitude of what I was holding. Jonathan had been quietly moving assets into accounts solely under his control. He had planned a future where I was sidelined, where every penny of what we had built together would go directly to him. My hands shook slightly as I sorted through the papers. The sense of betrayal was suffocating, but beneath it, a cold clarity settled in. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. I had to be deliberate, strategic. I took photos of the documents with my phone, careful not to disturb the originals, and began making notes. Each transaction, each account, each whispered plan I had overheard became part of a larger picture, a map of Jonathan's intentions. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying memories like old films. I remembered our wedding day, his vows, the way he had looked into my eyes, and promised to always protect and love me. I thought about the quiet nights we had shared, the laughter in our kitchen over burnt toast, the comfort of his hand in mine. And then I remembered the message, the words that burned into my memory: when she dies, I get all the money. The juxtaposition was cruel, a bitter twist that left me reeling. But amidst the anger and sorrow, a sense of empowerment began to grow. I realized that I wasn't powerless. I had the advantage of observation, of knowledge, and the clarity that came with waking from a haze, both literal and metaphorical. Jonathan had underestimated me, assuming that my accident and hospital confinement would leave me helpless. He was wrong. Over the next few days, I continued my quiet surveillance. I listened when he made calls, noting names, numbers, and transactions. I watched him interact with the nurses and staff, noting subtle patterns and inconsistencies in his stories. Each day, I grew more confident in my understanding of him, more certain that I could confront this situation on my own terms. One evening, the room was quiet, and I finally allowed myself a small measure of reflection. I thought about my life before Jonathan, the ambitions I had, the dreams I had quietly set aside for the sake of our marriage. I remembered the warmth of my family, the laughter of old friends, and the resilience I had cultivated over the years. These memories became my anchor, reminding me that I was more than just a patient or a wife. I was a person with agency, with the right to protect what was mine. It was during one of these quiet nights that I overheard the conversation that confirmed everything. Jonathan had stepped into the hallway to take a call, not knowing that I had learned to position myself perfectly to listen. The voice on the other end was low, familiar, calculating. "Yes, everything is on track," he said, his tone almost gleeful. "Once she's gone, the accounts are mine. Nobody will question it. It's all finalized. She has no idea." My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. The words were deliberate, cruel, and unmistakable. He was speaking as though I were already dead, as though my existence had no bearing on the life he was planning to lead. And in that moment, I realized just how much I had been deceived, how carefully he had orchestrated this plan without a hint of remorse. I felt a surge of emotion, anger, betrayal, sadness, but most of all, determination. I knew that I had to act, but I also knew that acting rashly could ruin everything. Jonathan was clever, meticulous, and confident in his charm. But I had patience, observation, and knowledge on my side. I would wait for the right moment, collect every piece of evidence, and ensure that when the truth came out, there would be no denying it. In the following days, I became almost invisible, a shadow observing every move he made. I took photos of documents, recorded conversations when possible, and cataloged every financial transaction he made in my notebook. Each small action felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been threatened, each observation a small victory in the battle I was preparing for. Jonathan, of course, remained oblivious. He smiled, brought me coffee, adjusted my pillows, and spoke in tones of love and care. Every gesture was a lie, every word a mask to hide his true intentions. And yet, in his arrogance, he had left behind enough clues for me to piece together the full picture. The irony was bitterly satisfying. In his attempt to control my life and my death, he had handed me the tools to expose him completely. One night, as I lay in the quiet hospital room, the moonlight filtering through the blinds, I thought about the person I was before all this. The Emily who trusted, who loved, who believed in the good in people. And then I thought about the Emily who had awakened to betrayal, who had seen the truth and who was learning to fight in ways she never thought necessary. The transformation was painful but also empowering. I was not just surviving, I was preparing to reclaim everything he had tried to take from me. I whispered to myself, a mantra of resilience and resolve. I see you, Jonathan, I see everything. And I will not be broken by your greed. It was quiet, almost inaudible, but it strengthened me. I knew the journey ahead would not be easy. Confrontation, exposure, and justice would require careful planning, patience, and courage. But I was ready. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense that despite the betrayal, I could control the outcome. And so, I waited, watched, and prepared, each day bringing me closer to the moment when Jonathan would realize that underestimating me had been his gravest mistake. I had been trapped in a hospital bed, vulnerable and dependent, yet somehow, I had found strength in observation, clarity in betrayal, and determination in despair. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: I would not allow Jonathan to take what was rightfully mine. Not now, not ever. The days that followed were a careful dance of observation and restraint. I learned to make myself small, to blend into the sterile hospital room as though I were merely another patient in recovery, a woman who needed help and care. But beneath that fragile exterior, my mind worked tirelessly, unraveling the web Jonathan had spun so carelessly around himself. I started keeping a detailed log in my notebook, each transaction, each whispered call, each suspicious gesture cataloged with meticulous care. There were bank statements hidden in drawers, envelopes tucked under piles of papers, and even emails that he thought I hadn't noticed. I saved screenshots on my phone, photographing each document with care, making sure I had undeniable proof. My hand sometimes shook as I wrote. My pulse quickened, but I told myself this was necessary. Every piece of evidence brought me closer to reclaiming my life. One afternoon, a nurse brought my lunch, the smell of tomato soup and fresh bread filling the room. I hardly touched it, my mind focused entirely on Jonathan. He had stepped out to take a call, and I knew that the moment he left, the window for discreet observation opened. I pulled my laptop closer, opened a secure folder, and started cross-referencing the documents I had collected. Each account, each transfer, each payment he had arranged without my knowledge became a thread in a pattern I was beginning to understand. And then came the call that shook me. Jonathan's phone rang loudly, piercing the quiet of the room. He answered immediately, his voice low and hurried, almost tense, a crack in the mask he usually wore so perfectly. Yes, I understand," he said, his words clipped. "Everything is going according to plan. Once she's gone, all of it is mine. Nobody will question it." My heart clenched, and my stomach turned. Hearing those words again, so cold, so deliberate, confirmed the depth of his betrayal. I realized in that instant that this wasn't just a fleeting scheme. This was a lifelong plan. Jonathan had been living a double life, nurturing a facade of love while plotting to take everything from me. The anger that surged through me was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to breathe, to steady my hands, to think. I knew that confrontation without preparation could be dangerous. Jonathan was clever, manipulative, and charming when he needed to be. But I also had the upper hand. I had evidence, I had clarity, and I had the resolve to act. That night, lying in the dim hospital room, I reflected on our marriage, the promises, the laughter, the small, tender moments that had once meant everything, the memory of our first apartment, the smell of his cologne mixed with burnt toast in the mornings, the warmth of his hand on my back as we walked through autumn streets. All of it felt like a cruel illusion now. Yet, those memories were also my compass. They reminded me that I had loved deeply, that I had been committed, and that my betrayal was not my fault. I began to craft a plan, piece by piece. First, I needed to secure all the evidence. I created encrypted folders on my laptop, backed up photos of documents, recorded audio of the conversations I could capture discreetly. I made notes on each account, each transaction, each legal loophole Jonathan was exploiting. Every night, I reviewed my findings, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. Then came the consideration of allies. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I reached out quietly to a family lawyer, explaining my situation without revealing too much. The lawyer's tone was calm but firm. "You need concrete evidence, Emily," she said. "Anything you have in writing, audio, or visual is invaluable, and we need to act carefully. He's trying to manipulate everything behind the scenes. The reassurance was comforting, a lifeline in the sea of betrayal. I knew that with the right support, Jonathan's plans could be exposed and justice could be served. But I also understood that timing was crucial. I had to wait for the perfect moment to confront him, when I had irrefutable proof and a strategy that would leave no room for manipulation. During those days, I observed him more closely than ever. He maintained the charade flawlessly in public, smiling at the nurses, adjusting my pillows, offering small comforts, all while moving money and securing assets in secret. It was infuriating to see the ease with which he wore his mask, but it also fueled my determination. I would not allow his charm to blind anyone to the truth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft amber glow through the blinds, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A document on the bedside table, a power of attorney form, was partially signed, the pen still resting on the paper. Jonathan had been planning to transfer legal control of our accounts and assets directly into his name. I quickly photographed it, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. This was the final piece I needed. The evidence was complete. I realized then that the confrontation was no longer just an option, it was a necessity. I couldn't remain passive while Jonathan manipulated our lives, planning for my absence as if I were already gone. I began to rehearse in my mind the words I would say, the documents I would present, the questions I would ask. Every scenario played out, every possible reaction anticipated. I felt a strange mix of fear and empowerment, a recognition that I was stepping into a battle I had no choice but to win. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of confrontation and justice. I woke in the early hours, the hospital quiet except for the soft hum of machines. I reviewed my notes, checked my encrypted files, and ensured that every piece of evidence was secure. The meticulous preparation was almost ritualistic, a way to regain control over a life that had been threatened by deception. Finally, the day came when I felt ready. Jonathan entered the room with his usual practiced smile, unaware that the woman he had underestimated was now armed with every piece of evidence needed to dismantle his carefully constructed plan. I felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of days spent observing, documenting, and preparing. My pulse quickened, but my hands were steady. I would confront him, and I would ensure that the truth could no longer be hidden. I reached for my laptop, the encrypted files glowing softly on the screen, and took a deep breath. The calm before the storm was a strange comfort. I knew that once this began, there would be no turning back. The betrayal had been laid bare, the evidence undeniable, and my resolve unwavering. Jonathan had underestimated me, assuming that my recovery would leave me powerless. He was wrong. As he approached, I met his eyes with a quiet intensity, a calm that belied the storm inside me. "Jonathan," I said, my voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." And just like that, the moment of truth had arrived. Jonathan froze when he saw me standing there, laptop open, files ready, evidence meticulously laid out. For a moment, the practiced ease that had always defined him flickered, and I caught a glimpse of something raw fear. It was brief, fleeting, but enough to tell me he realized the walls he had built were crumbling. "Emily, what's this?" he asked, his voice measured but strained. The smile he often wore like armor was gone, replaced by a tension that made his jaw tight. I took a step closer, closing the distance that had always given him control. "Do you really think I haven't noticed? Do you think all the transfers, the secret accounts, the power of attorney, do you think I wouldn't see it?" My voice didn't shake. It was calm, deliberate, cutting through the air like a knife. He swallowed, glanced at the laptop, then back at me. "Emily, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered. "You have to understand." I shook my head slowly. "No, Jonathan, I understand perfectly. I understand that you've been planning for me to disappear, planning to take everything while pretending to care for me. I understand that you were smiling at me, while lining your pockets with what should have been ours." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Outside, the hospital corridors hummed with distant footsteps and beeping machines. But inside that room, it was as though the world had shrunk to the space between us. His eyes darted, looking for an escape, a way to salvage the situation. But there was none. Every angle I had anticipated, every excuse he might offer, was already accounted for in my preparation. I opened the first file, sliding it across the bed so he could see the date, the transactions, the carefully documented evidence of his duplicity. These, I said, pointing, are just the beginning. Every account, every payment, every step you've taken to ensure you get everything if anything happened to me, it's all here. And there's more. Jonathan's face paled. His fingers flexed, gripping the edge of the table. Emily, I can explain, he said, but the certainty in his voice had vanished, replaced by a fragile edge of desperation. Explain? I echoed, my voice rising just slightly, not in anger but in disbelief. Explain that you were ready for me to die, so you could inherit everything? Explain that while I was unconscious, trusting you, you were securing your future at my expense. The words hung in the air, like glass, sharp and unyielding. He shook his head, muttering something that was lost in the tension between us. I could see the rationalizations forming in his mind, the excuses he would have used if I had not uncovered everything. But I didn't allow him to speak. I laid out every piece of evidence, moving slowly, deliberately. Bank statements, hidden emails, unsigned contracts, audio recordings, all meticulously organized. His gaze shifted from the files to me and back again. Fear was evident now, creeping into his expression in a way I had never seen before. The arrogance that had always defined him had evaporated, leaving behind a man exposed, vulnerable, and cornered. You've underestimated me, Jonathan, I said softly, leaning in, my hands resting on the bed. You thought I would recover and never notice. You thought I would forgive blindly. You thought I would be too weak, too sick, too scared to fight back. But I'm none of those things. And now, everything you've tried to hide, it's all out in the open. He swallowed hard, his lips pressed together, and for the first time, I saw him as he truly was, not the charming, confident husband I had married, but a man consumed by greed and selfishness. Emily, please, he began, but I cut him off. No, Jonathan. Please won't work anymore. The trust we had is gone. The love we shared, if it ever truly existed, is gone. And your plan, this plan of yours to profit from my life, as though it had no value, is over. He sank into the chair, his hands buried in his face. For a moment, I considered walking away, leaving him to the collapse of his own making. But I needed this to be more than a private confrontation. I needed accountability. I needed justice. Everyone will know, I continued, my voice steady. The lawyer knows, the authorities will know, our families will know. No longer can you hide behind charm and smiles. No longer can you pretend this is anything but what it is, betrayal at its worst. His head lifted slightly, eyes meeting mine, and I saw panic there, the dawning realization that his carefully constructed life was unraveling. Emily, don't do this. We can fix it. I shook my head. No, Jonathan. Some things can't be fixed. Some things require acknowledgement, restitution, and consequence. You've chosen your path, and now you must face it. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the hospital machines. His breathing was uneven, shallow, a mirror to the chaos of his mind. I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve, sorrow for the man I had once loved, and resolve for the woman I was becoming. The Emily who would not be silenced, the Emily who had fought for her life, her dignity, and her justice. I took one last look at him, my hand lingering briefly on the laptop. Everything you've done, every lie, every hidden move, it's all documented. And when the world sees it, there will be no excuse, no forgiveness, no escape. The moment you thought you would inherit my life, my fortune, and my future, you underestimated the strength of the woman you married. He remained silent, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, the tension in his hands, the hollowness in his eyes. For a man who had plotted so meticulously, he was utterly unprepared for the consequences of exposure. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I understood something vital. I was no longer a victim. The woman waking in that hospital bed, weakened by illness but sharpened by betrayal, had found her voice, her clarity, and her power. I would move forward not just for myself, but for the truth, for the justice that was owed, and for the life that Jonathan had tried to steal. After that confrontation, I knew the next steps had to be careful but decisive. Jonathan wasn't just my husband. He was someone who had manipulated, schemed, and hidden behind a mask of charm for years. Exposing him was no small thing, and it had to be done in a way that left no room for denials or half-truths. The lawyer I had contacted was meticulous. I handed over every piece of evidence, every document, every recording. This isn't just about money, I told him. It's about accountability, and it's about making sure no one else falls for this. He nodded, his expression serious, and I felt a measure of relief. For the first time in months, someone was on my side completely, without question. It didn't take long for the legal wheels to start turning. Letters were sent, hearings scheduled, and soon Jonathan had no choice but to face scrutiny from the authorities, the bank, and even our closest friends and family. The man who had once commanded the room with a simple smile now shuffled through it, shrinking under the weight of exposure. I remember the day my sister, Claire, came to visit me at the hospital. She had known for some time that something was wrong. She could see it in my hesitation, the way I avoided certain topics, the subtle way I watched Jonathan. But the full extent, she learned in those moments, after the confrontation. "Oh, Emily," she whispered, sitting beside me on the hospital bed. She grasped my hands as if holding me steady in a storm. "I can't believe her voice broke, and I felt a wave of validation. My instincts had been right. My doubts had been real. And now, finally, they were being seen. "He thought he could get away with it," I said quietly, my voice calm but firm. "He thought I wouldn't see, wouldn't notice, wouldn't act. But I did. And now everyone will see." Claire nodded, squeezing my hands. "Good. He deserves to face this. And you deserve to breathe again." The public consequences were swift. The bank froze all accounts Jonathan had attempted to manipulate, and a formal investigation began. Friends who had once accepted his stories without question now approached me, apologizing for not seeing the signs, for not noticing his pattern of deceit. Even some distant relatives, who always whispered behind his back but never acted, stepped forward to support me. It was strange, this combination of relief and exhaustion. Relief that justice was finally in motion. Exhaustion from the months of tension, the sleepless nights, and the gnawing anxiety that had accompanied me since my hospitalization. I had imagined this confrontation countless times in my mind, rehearsing my words, my gestures, the evidence I would present. But living it, feeling it, hearing Jonathan's fear firsthand was a different kind of intensity altogether. The hospital itself became a temporary stage for these revelations. Nurses who had noticed my husband's unusual behavior, the way he lingered too long at certain moments, or asked questions that didn't make sense, now looked at him differently. Some avoided him, others whispered in the corridors. The man who had seemed untouchable in his control over me was now visibly fraying. At the edges, his confidence eroded by exposure and public accountability. One afternoon, a social worker came to speak with me, helping me navigate the aftermath and the legal intricacies. "You've handled this with remarkable composure," she said, reviewing the documents I had compiled. "Many people in your situation would crumble under the weight of betrayal and fear. You've done more than that. You've ensured that truth prevails." Her words, gentle and sincere, gave me a sense of grounding I hadn't felt in months. It was as though the chaos that had consumed me was finally being organized, channeled into action, into something purposeful. I realized that my battle wasn't just about stopping Jonathan, it was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my voice. When the hearings began, Jonathan's facade cracked further. Friends and colleagues testified, showing patterns of manipulation and deceit. His defense crumbled under the weight of documented proof, leaving him exposed in ways he could never have anticipated. Every document I had meticulously gathered became a nail in the coffin of his lies. And through it all, I felt a quiet, steady power that came from knowing the truth was on my side. I also learned something important during these days. People often underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has suffered. They think pain makes you fragile, but it can also make you precise, resilient, and unyielding. My months in the hospital, my illness, my confrontation with betrayal, they had honed me into someone who would not be ignored, someone who could face fear without flinching. The public exposure wasn't cruel, it was necessary. Jonathan needed to see the impact of his choices, not just on me, but on everyone around him. He had treated our life, our marriage, and my very existence as a commodity, something to be exploited. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity, consequence, and restoring balance. Even as the hearings drew attention from family and friends, I focused on myself. Therapy helped me process the betrayal, understand my own feelings of grief and anger, and recognize that healing was a deliberate, patient act. I began small, with walks in the hospital garden, reading quietly in my room, reconnecting with old friends who had been pushed aside by Jonathan's schemes. Each step, each breath, reminded me that life could be rebuilt, even after such profound deception. By the time Jonathan faced the final hearing, I felt a sense of closure forming within me. He was held accountable, not in anger, but in a structured, lawful, undeniable way. Every hidden account, every transfer, every plan he had made for my death or absence was revealed, and the consequences were imposed. The man who had tried to profit from my life learned, finally, that actions have weight, and betrayal carries a cost. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a quiet, steady pride, not for vengeance, not for humiliation, but for endurance, for courage, for the reclaiming of my life. I had faced the darkest intentions of someone I had trusted, and I had emerged not broken, but strengthened. Life after the confrontation became a journey of reconstruction. I moved to a small apartment nearby, a space filled with light and calm. I decorated it with books, plants, and small things that made me smile. I reconnected with colleagues, found joy in ordinary routines, and allowed myself the freedom to dream again. The hospital, once a place of fear and betrayal, now held memories of resilience. I often looked at the garden from my window, the sun reflecting off the leaves, and felt a profound sense of peace. The world hadn't been perfect, but I had found clarity, accountability had been served, and I had learned a lesson that I would carry forward always. Trust must be earned, awareness must be maintained, and personal strength is invaluable. The days after the hearings felt lighter, though not immediately easy. I woke up each morning with a sense of cautious optimism, as if the sun itself was willing me to take the first steps toward a life that wasn't defined by betrayal. There were moments when fear or memory of Jonathan's words crept in, those cruel words about money, about waiting for my death. But I faced them with a kind of quiet determination I hadn't known I possessed before. I decided to reclaim parts of myself I had neglected over the years. Simple things first. Cooking meals that reminded me of home, tending to the small balcony garden I had always wanted, and reconnecting with old friends. I realized that while Jonathan had tried to control my life, he could not steal my capacity to feel joy, or my ability to love my own existence. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the sheer curtains, I sat with a notebook and began writing, pouring out memories, fears, and even forgiveness. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to process the months of pain, confusion, and anger. I wrote about the moment I first suspected Jonathan, about the cold shock of hearing his words about money, and about the months of preparation that led to the courtroom. But I also wrote about the strength I discovered within myself, the quiet resilience that had carried me forward even when the world seemed uncertain. In these quiet moments, I began to understand something profound. Healing wasn't linear. There would be days of tears, of remembering, of questioning myself, but there would also be days of laughter, of small victories, of reclaiming what had been stolen. I had been through a storm, yes, but storms reveal the strength of roots that often go unnoticed until the wind forces them into awareness. Family became an essential part of this reconstruction. Claire was by my side through almost every step, helping me navigate paperwork, attend follow-up appointments, and sometimes simply sit with me when the memories felt overwhelming. My parents, who had been cautious at first, finally allowed themselves to lean into the situation, offering support without judgment. Even distant relatives, once estranged due to Jonathan's subtle manipulation, reached out, creating a web of support I hadn't realized I still had. One morning I decided to visit a small art studio nearby. Painting had always been a quiet joy, a way to express emotions I couldn't voice aloud. The smell of fresh paint and the feel of a brush in my hand reminded me that creation, not destruction, was the path forward. I began small, abstract shapes and muted colors, but with each stroke, I felt layers of fear and resentment peel away. By the time I left the studio that day, I felt lighter, as though each line on the canvas had lifted a shadow from my shoulders. Financial matters were still complex, of course. Jonathan had attempted to siphon wealth from accounts and investments we had built together. But with legal oversight and careful guidance, I managed to reclaim what was rightfully mine. It was not about money alone, though it was a relief to secure my independence. It was about reclaiming control, about proving to myself that betrayal did not have the final say in my life. I also began speaking with a counselor about the emotional impact of betrayal. One session stands out in my mind. I sat across from her, hands trembling slightly, as I recounted the words Jonathan had said, the cold calculation behind them, and the years of subtle manipulation that had prepared me for disbelief. She listened without interruption, her eyes steady, and then she said something simple that struck me deeply. You survived this. You are here. That is strength, Emily. Never forget it. Those words became a mantra. I repeated them in my mind on difficult days, when doubt tried to creep in. I reminded myself that survival was not passive. It was active, courageous, and deserving of recognition. Each morning I woke, I reclaimed a small piece of freedom, whether it was choosing my own meals, taking a long walk in the park, or simply sitting in silence with my thoughts. Gradually, I began to trust again, not blindly, as I once had, but with discernment and self-respect. Friendships deepened. I learned to listen to my instincts, to question motives without paranoia, and to honor my own voice. I discovered that true trust grows slowly and must be nourished with honesty and integrity, not convenience or manipulation. One evening, as I sipped tea on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, I felt a sense of calm that had been absent for far too long. The house that had once felt like a cage, filled with hidden intentions and whispered greed, was now just a memory, a lesson in vigilance and self-worth. The world felt wider, softer, and full of possibility again. I thought about Jonathan, about the man who had tried to profit from my misfortune. I felt no need for vengeance. His accountability had been served, and justice had been applied. Holding on to anger would only anchor me to the past. Instead, I chose forgiveness, not for his sake, but for mine, to release the weight I had carried. Forgiveness does not erase betrayal. It restores peace to the one who was hurt. As the months passed, my life became quieter, but in that quietness was depth, reflection, and growth. I returned to work part-time, engaging with colleagues who respected my strength and supported my healing. I found joy in ordinary routines, cooking meals, tending to plants, reading novels that transported me to new worlds, and sharing laughter with friends who had stood by me. Emily, the woman who had woken in a hospital bed to the cold realization of betrayal, had evolved. She was cautious, yes, but also empowered. She had faced fear, uncovered deceit, reclaimed her resources, and nurtured her emotional and spiritual well-being. Every step forward was a testament to resilience, a reminder that life can be rebuilt even after profound disruption. I began volunteering at a local women's center, sharing my experience with those navigating betrayal and manipulation. I realized that while my story was painful, it could serve as guidance, a light for someone else lost in the darkness of deceit. Empathy and experience became tools of healing not only for myself but for others, needed reassurance that they could survive, reclaim their dignity, and find strength. Looking back, I understood that Jonathan's words, the cruel declaration about money, and my potential death had been a catalyst. They had forced me to confront the reality of who he was and what I would tolerate in my life. And while the moment itself had been shattering, it had also been clarifying. I had been given the opportunity to see clearly, to act decisively, and to grow from the experience. Now each morning I wake with gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for family and friends who supported me, and for the inner strength that allowed me to navigate betrayal and emerge whole. I am no longer the woman defined by someone else's greed or cruelty. I am Emily, whole, aware, and capable of living life on my terms. And those scars remain quiet reminders of lessons learned. They are no longer burdens. They are markers of resilience, symbols of endurance, and testament to the strength of the human spirit. I have learned that life, even when marred by betrayal, can be reclaimed with courage, patience, and self-respect. As I sit here now, watching the sunlight spill across my balcony, I think about how fragile trust can be, and how strong a person becomes when it is broken and rebuilt. Emily, the woman who woke in a hospital bed to the harsh truth of her husband's greed, is no longer the same. She is quieter, yes, but stronger. She is reflective, yes, but empowered. And she is, above all, free, not because someone gave her freedom, but because she claimed it for herself. I want to share this with you because sometimes life will test you in ways you never imagined. The people we trust the most can hurt us, and the betrayal can cut deep enough to make us question not just them, but ourselves. But here's the thing. The moment we realize our own strength, the moment we begin to nurture ourselves, the moment we act with courage and integrity, that is when we take back our lives. Emily's story is not just about loss or deceit. It is about resilience, awareness, and the quiet power that comes from standing in your own truth. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending that the past didn't happen or that people's actions weren't wrong. Healing means learning to live alongside the memories, the lessons, and even the scars, while reclaiming joy and purpose. It means surrounding yourself with people who lift you up, investing in the parts of life that make your heart feel alive, and never letting anyone define your worth for you. Sometimes we wish justice were swift, or that those who hurt us would feel the weight of their choices immediately. But life doesn't always move that way. Justice often comes quietly, sometimes in unexpected forms. In Emily's case, it came through truth, accountability, and the reclaiming of her independence. And that, I think, is a victory worth celebrating, not because someone else suffered, but because she survived and flourished. So, I ask you, dear listener, when faced with betrayal, when confronted with harsh truths about someone you love, how would you respond? Would you let it define you? Or would you use it as a catalyst to uncover your own strength? Would you allow fear to close doors? Or would you open them to new beginnings? Emily's journey reminds me, and I hope it reminds you, that life is fragile, but the human spirit is resilient. We may stumble, we may grieve, and we may feel lost, but we can always rise. We can always reclaim what is ours, not just in possessions, but in dignity, peace, and the ability to live fully. If her story resonates with you, if you faced a betrayal that shook your foundation, I invite you to take a moment today to honor your survival, to reflect on your own resilience, and to find one small step toward reclaiming your own life. And if you feel moved to share your thoughts, your story, or your own lessons learned, please do so in the comments. You never know who might find hope in your words. Remember, dear friends, it is not the betrayal that defines us, it is how we rise from it, how we heal, and how we continue to live with courage and grace.